power sector expert. He's done himself, mashallah, a generator, power generator, but has long experience of IPP, of power generation all over the world. And mashallah has come back to Pakistan, and not only is he a power businessman himself, but he's also been involved in the power sector regulation, design, etc., etc. So I think this is a very important webinar, where we will hear from one of the experts कि जी हमारे सेक्टर में issues क्या हैं, problems क्या हैं, and will we ever get out of this mess? मुझे तो नहीं लग रहा. Nadeem साहब, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Saab. The fact that you are sitting in the session, I think is going to be a very lively session. I'm quite sure. So, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you all for having me here. मैं दो तीन जरा opening caveats बता दूं, and then we'll get started. And the way we'll run it is I'll talk maybe 30 to 40 minutes, just go over some slides, and then we'll open for discussion, questions, however you want to take it. First caveat, I will primarily focus on power and gas. I will not talk about oil or LPG, which are the other two parts of the energy equation, but in the question answer session, if somebody wants to discuss those, I'm happy to address those also. Second caveat, everything that I'm going to show to you in terms of numbers and data, all of it is from government sources. There's nothing in there which I cannot tell you which document, which publication, where it's coming from, so that we kind of do away with any debate about whether the data is authentic or not. Since it's a very heavy subject, let's start with a little bit of a lighter tone. Can somebody tell me what the famous energy equation is of Einstein from relativity? E is equal to mc square. Does everybody agree with that? All right. Let's see. This is actually the equation. It is not E is equal to mc square. There is another factor in it. E is equal to mc square square plus pc square. Anybody with interest in physics, can somebody explain to me what this pc square is? See, there comes the economist. Anybody who's had physics background, anybody who understands what's the difference between special relativity and general relativity. P is actually the momentum of a particular particle. So if we deal with what we deal with as human beings on Earth, where we're dealing with stationary object compared to speed of light, then P becomes 0. And this factor disappears. And then the equation is E is equal to mc square. Well, the question is, what relevance does that have to today's subject? And that's why I said I'll try to start on a lighter note. Let's take this equation, because the energy conundrum in Pakistan is really a question of balancing the energy equation. And if we don't balance it and continually get into an inequality, we will never get out of it, as Dr. Saab is pointing out. So let's take this equation and play with it a little bit. So let's play with it. So let's say in the Pakistan context, E is the energy revenue, M is the me and you, the customer, C is the cost of energy, and of course, the cost of energy is as high as the speed of light these days. P is what the government is going to pay as the subsidy, the PC. So you want to balance this equation, the cost of energy has to be paid by either the customer or the government. And just like what Einstein was saying, that in the normal course of things, the second part of the equation goes to 0. And it is E is equal to mc square. But that is what should happen here. The cost of energy should be paid by The customer who's using that energy. What does the government have to do with any of that? So under normal conditions, the government should not be paying anything. In unusual conditions and temporarily, okay, the government can pay something. What would be an unusual condition? We'll talk a little bit about that. But as an example, COVID hits. Asad Saab and I were both in the government. A decision was made that businesses are shut down. They cannot pay their electricity bills. So for 3 months, the bills were waived by the government. And for another 3 months, they were financed through installments. Now, that's an unusual condition. And most people would agree that you may have to have the sovereign step in at that point. But other than that, this should not be the standard. The standard should be E is equal to MC square, not the second part where an external component is coming in. But that raises a question. What if the cost of energy is just too high, is unreasonably high, and it is unaffordable for the customer? And if that is the case, why is it so high? And are there ways that you can actually lower it? So you have to understand that unless we balance these equations, we will continually remain in trouble. So as I now talk about power and gas, I'll be talking about the equations in those two sectors. So let's start with some of the fault lines. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm not going to go through standard chori band kar do, ye kar do, wo kar do, because these prescriptions have been there for God knows how long. Yes, they are essential. But what is it that's really ailing our energy sector? What are really the causes? So the first cause is the power and gas sectors in Pakistan, they really operate like a state monopoly. And even when private sector is inducted in a portion of that energy chain, it's done under fixed long-term contracts with the state entities with price controls. And what does that translate to? That translates to nothing more than rent seeking. Because that private sector operator in that chain has no ability to do anything other than just provide the capital that the government is unable to provide. Everything else is decided by the state. The second fundamental fault line we have is that our regulatory structure, both for power and gas, and frankly for LPG and petroleum products also, is based on a system of cost plus margin. And what that really means is the regulator decides what is the cost, and the capital provider is told, okay, you will get this cost, plus you'll get some return that the regulator decides is appropriate, and that results in the consumer price. It has nothing to do with the supply and demand dynamics, which in a free market, you would expect that supply and demand interact. And if somebody is making too much money, more supplier comes in, prices come down. If not enough money is being made, some people go bankrupt, prices go up. The price is reached through an equilibrium of demand and supply balance. Our system is completely different. Our system says, we don't really care about what the demand and supply dynamics are. We will decide what the cost is. And on top of that, we'll give a return. And those two added together, they define what the price is for the consumer. The third is that when you have these two powerful factors structurally that I've just explained, what you've created is an opportunity for, call them elites, call them mafias, call them rent seekers. You've created an opportunity where you are saying, if you can find a place in this chain You will get rent on your capital. You will make money because everything else is decided by the government. So there's really no reason for a player in this kind of a regulatory environment and structure to try to find efficiency in what is being done. And then the next issue is that because of political compulsions, or at least using them as an excuse, even when we deliver energy, the state entities deliver energy, whether it's gas, whether it is power, and they send a bill, and the bill is not paid, it's kind of ignored. Don't worry about it. It's a politically sensitive issue. We can't really do anything about it. And it happens time and time and time again. We'll talk a little bit more about it. And then finally, the policy formulation that we do as a result of all of this, it is completely flawed. It is completely flawed and completely disconnected from what the market dynamics are. So the result of all this is the state monopolies, state entities are monopolies in most cases. Discos are a monopoly. NTDC is a monopoly. SUI companies are monopolies. LNG is a monopoly. And therefore, there is no competitive pressure to reduce the inefficiencies, to reduce the losses. And all of this becomes, quote unquote, part of the cost. And remember, the structure is cost plus return is what becomes the price. And when cost is not fully recovered, this subsidy has to be funded by the budget. There is no other source. Go back to the first equation I showed to you. And if it is not funded through the budget, and instead the state says to SUI Northern or to the LNG entity or to DISCOs, I'm going to give a guarantee to the lenders, to the banks, go borrow under it. Effectively, what has happened is you've just used another balance sheet. You've not extinguished that liability. You've not retired that liability. You now have a cost of money on that liability that is accruing. Liability is still standing there. And that is what circular debt is. That's the circularity about this debt. You're using different balance sheets in the chain to borrow money when you should have extinguished that liability as a policy through budget, if that's what you decided to do. Now, in addition to this, I talked about policy flaws. Our wrong policy choices have resulted in a high dependency on imported energy, making us subject to external shocks. I'll give you two numbers, government data. Of the roughly 80 billion of total import dollars that we needed last year, 29.5% was spent on importing energy. That's roughly $24 billion last year. This year, that number is going to be about 27 billion. We spent that on importing energy, LNG, oil, and coal. And the result was that 47% of all electricity generated in fiscal year 23 was on imported fuels. This year, the number will be about 46, so roughly the same. Imagine that half of the energy you're generating is subject to external shocks of dollar value and international market pricing. And the third is that even when you have the ability to generate all this energy, whether it's gas or whether it's electricity, if you cannot transport all of it and get it to the ultimate consumer, what you've done is you've spent a lot of money on the infrastructure, and the utilization of that capital is very low. And this is for a country that is perpetually capital starved. If you have a capital starved country, your capital needs to be working 100% of the time. not 30 or 40% of the time. So the wrong policy choices have led to these results. And with no enforcement of government rate, when a bill is sent, non-payment of bills has now become an entitlement. It's almost become a culture in many parts of the country. People treat it as their right, that I am going to get free energy. Whether it is gas in the winter or whether it's electricity in the summer, I don't have to pay the bill. I'm entitled to it because this has gone on for way too long. And unfortunately, when all of these ills appear, the modus operandi of the government is, rather than addressing the causes, it likes to address the symptoms. And the way it addresses the symptoms is by more regulation and by controls and by renegotiations of contracts. And the core issue still remains there. The patient has a fever. You give a Panadol, the fever goes away. But fever appears again next day. Every day you give a Panadol, you do not try to address why the patient is having that fever every day. That is what we've been doing. We keep plugging the gap by borrowing more and just paying, and we do not address why the gap is there to begin with. So all of this, what it ends up doing is what I would call a snowball effect. The energy revenue collected is less than the cost of delivery of that energy. Equation is not balanced. It has turned into an inequality. And that results in circular debt being created, whether it's power or whether it's gas. And that circular debt is periodically retired, but not through budget, by bank borrowing. And when you do that, the cost of that borrowing, the financial charge of that borrowing, especially today, it adds to the overall cost of delivery of that product or service. Somebody's got to pay it. And both of these factors result in further increasing the consumer tariff. And when that happens, you're compounding the problem. It's a snowball effect because you've lessened the affordability of the consumer. You've created a demand destruction, and you've created a situation where there is more incentive to steal and not pay. And demand destruction happening right now. In the last 24 months, the electricity demand from the grid has gone down 21%. 21%. So all that fixed capital that was spent, now you have 21% less units to divide it by. Your unit cost has gone up. Your unit cost goes up, the affordability of the consumer goes down, the consumer is more likely by choice or by force to steal more or not pay. Some of you may remember when Ronald Reagan took over the American presidency in the early 80s, the US economy was in complete shambles. They were going through a massive bout of stagflation. Deficits were sky high. And there was an economics professor by the name of Arthur Laffer. He came up with what was called the Laffer curve, which Ronald Reagan deployed in his policymaking. And the Laffer curve basically said that if you lower the tax rate, you will actually collect more taxes. And that is exactly what happened. In the energy sector, that is where we are today. The more you increase the rates, the less you will collect. Because you haven't addressed the cause. You're just trying to put bandages on top of a bleeding sore. So now let's come to the two equations, the power sector equation and the gas sector equation. And then I'll just conclude with some broad principles and we can have a question answer session. So what is the power sector equation? Again, remember Einstein, we have to balance this equation. The cost of delivery of power today is the generation cost all the plants in the country at the plant gate. You add them up, you have an average. It is the actual transmission and distribution cost, which means all the employees, the personnel, the spare parts, the vehicles, everything that is needed by NTDC and the DISCOs to deliver that power, take that power from the plants and deliver them to the consumers. The third factor is what's called ATC. ATC is a very benign sounding acronym. It stands for aggregate technical and commercial losses. And it includes three things. It includes pure technical losses, it includes non-payment of bills, and it includes theft. This number, to give you a sense, I'll show you, actually, let me show you a slide later on, and you'll see how big this number is. So the true cost of delivery of electricity to a consumer today is these three things: the generation cost, the actual cost of the transmission and distribution system, and the third is all the leakages. On the revenue side, the revenues, nahi ji usme losses nahi, losses alada. The revenue side is the bills you actually collect, not the bills you've generated, but the bills you've actually realized, plus the subsidy that the government has actually paid, not announced and never paid, but actually paid. So what has been happening is that the revenue and the cost are not matching. There is inequality. The cost is more than the revenue, and we keep creating what we call circular debt. Now, why is the cost so high? I raised that question right at the start. What if the cost is unreasonably high? How can we expect a consumer to pay an unreasonably high cost? Well, let me again give you numbers. In 2023, fiscal 2023, 47% of generation was in imported fuels. This is a policy choice. 9,000 megawatts of power generation plants were added from 2013 to 2019, all on imported fuels. 9,000, 4,800 megawatts on LNG, and about 4,200 megawatts on imported coal. So what do we expect? Second, we've seen the highest interest rates. Why do we have such a high interest rate? Well, we have fiscal imbalance. Of course, it's going to result in high interest rates. The third is we have a balance of payment imbalance, external imbalance, the twin deficits, if you will. So what is that going to do? We have 47% fuel being imported. All the machinery is imported. State Bank for several years now says you want to build an infrastructure project, you cannot use dollars from the country. You have to bring dollars as foreign loans. The foreign loans have to be serviced in dollars. Exchange rate goes from 130 to 280 in a period of 3 years. What do we expect? And the aggregate technical and commercial losses are unreasonably and unsustainably high in some of them, some of the DISCOs. So bottom line is, when the cost goes up for any of these factors, the three factors that I've mentioned, and there isn't a matching increase in revenue to keep the equation in balance, that gap becomes circular debt. That gap keeps accumulating. You may park it on different balance sheets, but it's still there. It ain't going away. So when everybody says circular debt is the problem, I tell them circular debt is not the problem. Circular debt is the symptom. Try to understand what is causing that. Try to understand what is the problem. Now, do we really think that's a surprise? Just look at this. The previous Secretary of Finance and I did a joint session at the Staff College a couple of months ago. And this was one of his slides. I borrowed it from him. You can see that as a nation, at least for the last 25 years, we've had a massive fiscal deficit. We haven't been balancing our books at a federal macro level. So is it a surprise that in the energy equation, our books are not balanced? Well, that's what we're doing. Energy is a microcosm of what we're doing at an economy level. And the numbers keep increasing. You can see it. The same phenomenon is happening in the energy sector for many reasons, including this whole notion that we choose to live beyond our means. And we've been doing that for a long time. Now, I talked about monopoly in the sector. Let me, for those of you who are uninitiated, let me give you a flavor of this, what this monopoly means. The power sale price by generators is decided by the government regulator, NEPRA. The price of fuels is decided by the GOP, except imported coal. The conversion efficiency of any power plant is decided by the regulator. The choice of fuel for what new plants to put up is decided by the government. The allowable cost of capital is decided by the regulator. The interconnection is decided by NTDC. The dispatch of how much a plant can, should, will run is decided by the dispatcher, a government entity. The maintenance of when you can shut down your plant to maintain, unless there is an unscheduled breakdown, in which case you don't have a choice, but otherwise you need to do maintenance, you cannot decide that. The dispatcher decides when you will do your maintenance. The generators are legally not allowed to sell power to anybody other than the government discos, legally. And the CPPA today, under a lot of pressure over the last 10 years that they need to allow wheeling. Somebody wants to do a B2B sale, there's a buyer, there's a seller, but you have to use the transmission and distribution system. After many years of fighting, we are at a stage where there's a law on the table called CTBCM. And you know what the CPPA, the parent sort of company of discos, is saying? Pay me 27 rupees per kilowatt hour to move your electricity. That's not the cost of electricity. That's the cost of using my system. The cost of electricity will probably be less than that. Saying, pay me 27 if you want to use my system. And there are other conditions, as they say, tariffs and non-tariff barriers. There are other non-tariff barriers. They really don't want any B2B transaction to happen. So in this environment, while we can say that private sector IPPs operate in this structure, it has nothing to do with private sector. This is a state monopoly. So what is the role of a private sector player in this equation? Just look at the bottom. All they're doing is they're renting their capital. And they're getting a very nice return on rent as rent of their capital. They have nothing else to do. They can't decide anything else. Everything is decided by the state. Now let's see what has happened to the cost of power as a result of all this. This is a chart from NEPRA State of Industry Report 2023, latest report. The red part is the capacity payment, the infamous capacity payment, the fixed payments that are to be paid to power generators regardless. And that fixed part is for them to pay off their loans, to give them equity return, to buy insurance, to pay their staff. And then the blue part is the actual fuel cost that is used when they are dispatched, when they run, whether it's 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever demand is given to them. What you will notice is that the red part keeps getting bigger as a percentage, and the blue part keeps getting smaller. G. बार्स का यूनिट क्या है? बिलियंस. और नीचे नंबर्स देख रहे हैं आप? बिलियंस. ठीक है. So trillions rather. This is a comma. So 2 trillion. ठीक है? So और इसका ब्रेकअप भी आपको मिल जाएगा नेप्रा की रिपोर्ट में. Why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because if the utilization of your power plants keeps going down, this fixed payment divided by that lesser number of units will keep increasing the unit price. The energy part is how many units you've actually used. But the fixed part, if the denominator keeps dropping, the unit price will keep increasing on the fixed part. So when I tell you that in the last 2 years, 21% demand has gone down, that means that the capacity component of your tariff has actually gone up because the denominator has gone down by that much. That fixed amount is still there. So you may say, and a lot of press says this, well, it's these rogue generators who are charging this capacity payment. And if that were not the case, everything would be great. Well, let's see who these, before I get to that, let me show you something else. The next chart I'm going to show you is a policy flaw. And this chart, by the way, was presented to the Prime Minister 3 days ago in a big presentation. This was one of the charts. So it's not my chart, it's the Ministry of Water and Power chart. What you will notice is if you go across the months in a year, you will see that the summer peak is 30,154 megawatts. And you will see that the base demand, which is there pretty much constantly throughout the year, is 12,500 megawatts. This 12,500 is actually the peak in any day in 365 days. So on a winter day, the maximum that you could sell is 12,500. The lowest point actually, which is not shown on this chart, is 8,900. Usually happens end of November, beginning of December. At night time, the total demand in the system is only 8,900 megawatts. So we have a system that has been designed to cater to the summer peak of 30,000 megawatts. But almost 6 months in the year, our demand is less than half of that. What is this if not a policy flaw? That we keep adding what are called base load plants that are designed to run all the time. We dedicated them to grid. They cannot sell anywhere else, but we only use them half the time. So what we are doing is that the fixed payments that have to be given to them, we are doubling that in terms of unit price because they're only going to be used half the time or less. So this is not unusual. There are many countries where you have extreme weathers, where you see these swings. But when you have these swings, your policy has to be designed to procure power plants that are called base load, and then power plants that only supply in those peak periods. Of course, they will cost more for those peak periods, but you don't have to pay them the remaining 6-7 months in the year. We have never even thought of that as a policy approach. The entire rest of the world does that. We don't like to do that, all right? Well, we'll debate that later on. So with these two things that I've shown, let's try to figure out who are these culprits who get all these capacity payments. On July 14th, 2023, NEPRA issued their order for the next fiscal year, which is their projected costs. And when the year ends, then they will be converted into actuals. This is what that report shows. I've given you the date. You can go on NEPRA website. You can pull this report and you can read it. It projected that in the fiscal year 23-24, that's going to end in June, The total fixed payments to be made will be 1.954 trillion to all generators. Of these generators, 52% are owned by the government of Pakistan. And these 52% generators collect 45% of this capacity payment. 23% of the capacity is owned by CPEC projects. And most of that is ultimately owned by the Chinese government through various layers. They collect 40% of the fixed capacity payments. And what you would call pure private generators, IPPs, who are not government entities, they provide about 25% of the capacity and they collect about 15% of this fixed payment. Now, I have to explain that many of the private ones are older, so their rates have gone down, their debts are paid off. Many of the Chinese are newer. Yes. Capacity payment is given regardless. That's the problem, because all plants are procured that way. That's what I explained earlier, all right? So that's the total. This is coming straight out of NEPRA's report. So you will see that nuclear is 100% government owned. 443 billion out of 1954 billion goes to the government nuclear plants. Hydel is 90% government, 282 billion. RLNG plants, 75% government, 185 billion. And that's the breakup. Now, in an earlier chart I showed you, if you look at the bottom line, now this is the current projected number when the year will end. Now that number has gone to 2.112 trillion. When they projected it in last July, it was 1.954 trillion. So the final actual will be about 10% more than what they projected. Okay. This is also their number. The capacity payments have shot up for what reasons? FX, interest rates, and frankly, unnecessary addition of new capacity that we did not need with very low utilization. And I've already talked about 23% generation being on imported fuels. So I could ask a question very simply. Well, if the problem is the capacity payment and the government is itself receiving 45% of that capacity payment, why doesn't the government just stop receiving that? And 1 trillion will go away, and that 1 trillion translates to roughly 9 rupees in your unit rate. What's the problem? It's just a decision by the government. Well, the problem is the government didn't fund this. All these additions, the government did not fund them from its budget. Government borrowed money to build these plants. And that money has to be paid back. So when people say in the old days of WAPDA, everything was hunky-dory, and when private sector was inducted, everything went to hell. Well, in the old days of government WAPDA system, all the plants were built through PSDP, through budget. And you didn't have to worry about paying that capital back. Starting late 80s, the government said, I got no money in my budget. So either private sector builds it, or if I build it, I'll also borrow, and those borrowings have to be paid back. So the fact is that even if the government wishes to, it cannot write off this 1 trillion of capacity payment that it receives. As an example, the nuclear plants, K2, K3 built in Karachi that started up last year, these two plants were the biggest loan ever by China Exim in its history. And this was told to me personally by the China Exim president. $7 billion of loan, the largest single loan given by China Exim to any project. Well, of course, they want it back. They maybe are good friends with the friendship higher than Himalayas and deeper than the oceans, but money is money. Money's got to be paid back. And then, of course, we have another major problem. Again, a massive policy flaw. We built all these plants, but we didn't build enough transmission capacity. So from the south to north, the maximum we can move is 2,500 megawatts. Have you ever wondered why is it that almost every January we have a nationwide breakdown of electricity? Because the south and north transfer capability is limited. So we have a situation where in south we can produce about 4,000 megawatts of additional capacity at a marginal rate of 17 rupees, but we cannot transfer it. So we have to replace it with that capacity generated in the north with the marginal cost of 37 rupees. Just imagine. If this is not a policy flaw, what is? You keep building infrastructure, you keep building power plants, you cannot move all that electricity. Now let's talk about discos for a moment. So we've talked about generation cost. Remember, there were three elements. Generation cost, the actual cost of T&D, which by the way is very reasonable, about 2.5 rupees. And the third was ATC, aggregate technical commercial losses. So I've given you a post-mortem of the generation cost. Why is the generation cost so high? And there are two components, the capacity and energy. Why is the energy high? It depends on dollars. Why is the capacity high? Because we have low utilization, unnecessary addition, and not enough transmission capacity. All three resulting in the unit rate going beyond what would be reasonable. Let's talk about the third component, which is the ATC, the losses, discos. In, again, NEPRA report, in 2022-23, the last full fiscal year, the current year is still going on, the system generated 129 billion kilowatt hours. Out of this, 97 billion were actually sold because 25% were lost. Of that 97 billion that was sold, payment was received for only 90 billion. Because 7.5% units have appeared on somebody's meter. A bill has been generated. Payment has not been made. And in most cases, connection has not been severed. You add up all this, that's 400 billion years. 400 billion rupees in the previous year. This year, that number is likely to be about 500 billion. When we end the year in June. We ask, why is the price of power so high? Because we really want the government to get out of this equation and we want the consumers to pay for the power that they are getting. But the consumers are being fleeced. Why are they being fleeced? For the reasons I just explained. And why is all this happening? Because the structure of our power sector, and frankly, the same thing holds true for gas, is a state monopoly where the state decides everything. And only capital is being rented from private sector because the state doesn't have that capital of its own. Now, let's talk about the gas sector equation. The gas sector equation is exactly the same. The cost of delivery of gas, I know this is becoming heavy. I promise I'll finish in less than 10 minutes. The cost of delivery of gas is the cost at the wellhead or the cost of the LNG ship as it docks at the port, plus the actual transmission and distribution cost using the pipeline. Again, the personnel, the maintenance, the compressors, the energy used to move that gas, plus a capacity payment. Now remember, these are state entities. And that capacity payment is 17.2% on the value of the pipeline assets. So let me tell you a little secret. The first time capacity payment was contractually agreed by the government of Pakistan was in the 1950s to the two sui companies. It is continuing to date, 70 years later, 60 years later. That's the first time capacity payment was agreed. So if somebody says capacity payment is an anathema, well, capacity payment itself is not anathema. If you utilize that capacity 100%, it'll give you a great unit rate. But if you don't use it, but you still pay for it, then it will be an anathema. So that plus, in the gas sector, we don't call it ATC, we call it UFG, unaccounted for gas, like a UFO. We can't figure out who it is. We can't figure out where it is, all right? But that's the same thing, theft and leakage. So here, same story. The revenue side is bills collected plus subsidy paid. Except that in the gas sector, until last year, there was no budgeted subsidy except for textile sector, which varied anywhere from 40 to 90 billion a year, because we wanted to improve the bottom lines of our textile exporters, so we gave them cheaper energy. This year, that's not there either. But until last year, that was the only subsidy. G? No, that's cross subsidy, not budgeted subsidy. I'm coming to that. Now, when the cost goes up, same equation, same story. When the cost goes up, if you do not recover that cost by increased revenue, matching that cost, you will have an inequality. You will create circular debt. But here's the funny part. In gas sector, until 2013, there was no concept of a circular debt. In power, it started around 2010. In gas, until 2013, 2014, there was no concept of gas circular debt. Why? What happened that caused it after that? Well, for 4 years, from 2013 to 2017, gas cost was going up, but price was not increased for political reasons. So for 4 years, we kept building circular debt. The second thing we did was that when we inducted LNG into the system, again for political reasons, we made a choice. And we declared LNG as petrol rather than gas. So effectively, we said we have two different pricing systems. Gas has its own system, LNG has its own system. Because if LNG is not gas, OGRA cannot take the overall cost of gas and say this is what price needs to be. And what that resulted in was that when LNG was coming in at 4 times the cost of local gas, and we were diverting it to domestic sector in the winter and giving it to fertilizers at a much lesser rate, we were creating a circular debt. We were not recovering the cost. And those two things resulted in ballooning of gas circular debt in the last few years. So when Asad Saab and I were in the Petroleum Ministry, we spent a good 2 years trying to build a political consensus, which eventually resulted in approval of a law shortly after the two of us left, called WACOG, Weighted Average Cost of Gas. That law was passed in February 2022. More than 2 years have passed, that law has not been implemented. What that law does, it says, treat LNG as gas, put it in the basket, come out with your average cost of gas, and then decide which customer is to be charged what. Don't keep them separate, because when you keep them separate, there is no mechanism for you to recover that differential if you are selling LNG to a customer who's paying a lesser price. So the law has been there on paper now for more than 2 years. It is not being implemented. Again, political reasons. So same story, I'll not go through that level of detail, but in the gas sector, you have monopoly, you have inefficiencies, and you have policy flaws. The monopoly, except in the E&P sector, over 80% of the production is being done by government entities. Most foreign entities have left. Pipelines are complete monopoly, and they get 17.2% capacity payment, whether gas runs through those pipes or not, regardless of how much gas runs through those pipes. LNG import is a government monopoly, complete. LNG terminals are a government monopoly. While they're owned by private sector, but they are contracted to government. They cannot do anything else. UFG went up 300% after 2000, year 2000. So it's not that we can't control the theft. We used to control the theft, but it went up 300%. And we didn't do anything about it. And we chose not to resolve it. Why? In Balochistan, for example, the recovery of gas bills is less than 40%. Less than 40%. It's a political issue. Balochistan says, we produce gas, you don't give us gas. It's our gas, we're not going to pay for it. Okay, somebody's got to pay for it. You resolve a political issue politically. You can't push it under the carpet and expect that it'll go away. We choose to import LNG at $10 plus per million BTU, and we are prepared to sign Iran and Turkmenistan pipelines, which will cost us $9.50 per million BTU, but we don't want to pay our local producers anything more than $6. Why? It's a policy decision. It's easy to say, oh, you know, we're importing gas, this is the cost, can't really do anything. But when a local E&P company or a foreign company wanting to operate here says, look, $6 doesn't make economic sense for me to make this investment. It needs to be 7 or 8. Oh, that's too high. We're getting SUI at $2. Why should we pay you 8? Oh, bloody hell, you got SUI 60 years ago. The cost at that time versus today is different. And finally, we do not want to create an open access system. People have been clamoring. Again, when the two of us were in the government, we pushed through, passed the laws. Laws are all in place, but it's not allowed to happen. That you bring in your own gas, produce your own gas, use the pipeline, pay rent, and deliver it to your own customer. Can't do it. So in all this equation, one party I've not talked about is that's the capital provider. Can we really exonerate the capital providers? Can we say that they have no culpability in this thing? Well, I'll let you guys be the judge. I'll just give you some data points. Our best friend China has now refused to give any fresh lending and has even refused to give political risk insurance. International capital markets are closed to us today. Even multilaterals and DFIs have refused to lend more to the power sector and, broadly speaking, the energy sector. Local lenders, in case you didn't know, local lenders have just been forced to take a hit on PIA. 278 billion of government guaranteed loans on PIA balance sheet have been moved off the balance sheet so PIA can be privatized. And the way it was moved off, if we were to take the new terms and mark them to market today, it's a 50% hit to those banks. I'm just on last 2 slides, then we'll stop. What about equity investors, what we call the rent seekers? Well, dividend repatriation has been blocked by State Bank for the last 2 years, despite the fact that these are registered investments from abroad, not just in power sector, but all other sectors too. But in power sector, in addition to being registered with State Bank, they also have government contracts guaranteeing those repatriations. And State Bank is in clear violation of 2 investment protection acts. They have been constantly in violation of the law for the last 2 years. And in the last 24 months alone, those investors, whether they be multinational companies, whether they be power companies, gas companies, they've lost half the value in USD terms because of this. And sovereign contracts in the energy sector, both gas and power, have been forcibly renegotiated 3 times in the last 15 years. CPEC has not been touched. Now, in this environment, if there is a lender who chooses to lend, they of course will charge a very high premium. But the investors are now not seeing this as an investment. They're seeing it as a gamble. And the clearest proof of that is the government tendered twice a 600 megawatt government guaranteed solar plant in Muzaffargarh. Not a single bidder came in the last 12 months. Twice they tendered it. Not a single bid came. Forget the price. Nobody showed up. So unless we de-risk the economy, this perception of capital providers will not change. Now, are the capital providers to blame for it? Yeah, you can say they are, but you can also say they are not. If they have opportunities elsewhere, why would they do this? So here's the latest casualty. Telenor CEO, one of the best companies, foreign investors in Pakistan, they built from scratch and made Telenor one of the best telecom companies in Pakistan. They've just decided to exit, as you know, they signed up with Etisalat, owner of PTCL. And this is the statement that the CEO made. If an investor cannot repatriate profits from a country, then he will probably leave. And it goes on, says that same time we invested in Bangladesh and we have done fantastically well. And even though we grew Pakistan faster, but we've had to leave Pakistan. So just to conclude then, what should the role of the government be? Because everything I've explained to you so far basically said is the government that has converted the energy sector into a monopoly, government-controlled monopoly. And unless you break this and you force competition, you are not going to get to a point where prices come down and costs come down, thereby eliminating the need for the government to keep pumping money in to balance the equation. Well, let me tell you a little fact. If you take all the government-owned SOEs and take the federal government and provincial government footprint, add it all up, the government controls more than 50% of this economy. Well, you may be right. You may be right. By the way, I didn't include the military establishment in this thing. The number is very large. So if that's the case, how do we expect things to change? Government will often be less efficient than private sector when doing business and will often have more leakages. And these inefficiencies and leakages are masked by monopoly controls and plugged by subsidies. Ultimately, the cost of that subsidies is paid by all of us as taxpayers. And the regulatory structure has to shift from a control and approval regime to a compliance and predefined standard of service regime. And if the infrastructure is such that it cannot be built by private sector, let's say highways, well, you build it, but you make it open access. You define a toll, whatever it is, whether it's a telecom line, whether it's a power line, whether it's a gas line, or whether it's a highway. And finally, if for social reasons you really feel you need to give subsidy, like it happened in COVID, you target it. Who is the customer that actually needs that subsidy? So with this, I'll come to the conclusion. What would be the broad principles, in my mind, of the structural reform we need to get out of this mess? 7 things. Number 1, we need to end state monopolies. Unless we bring in competition and let zombie companies die and fit and efficient companies grow, we will not be able to lower the cost. We have to make open access for power and gas distribution. This will lower cost. And until that happens, the government has to recover cost of service. It can't continually get into this mess of unfunded subsidies and borrowed capital sitting on multiple balance sheets. And we have to deregulate instead of re-regulate. The whole world is moving towards deregulation, and we are going in the opposite direction. We keep regulating more and more. We have to commoditize energy. Highway needs to be there, whether it's a gas pipeline or whether it's a transmission line, and energy has to be traded as the commodity. It cannot be a monopoly service. And the pricing, this one is very important. We have a habit of distorting the prices to promote consumption. We really need to promote production, which will then automatically later on promote consumption. If we keep promoting consumption and not production, or at the expense of production, our GDP will never grow to the level that we need it to grow to. And finally, we need to make policies for the country and not the elected government. We have to get out of this mindset. What can I build and show in the next 3 years? We have to get out of this mindset. I'll not go, I put 2 pages, I'll leave them here, because when I say these things, people say, you're just talking about generalities. So there's 2 pages of specific action items, power and gas. Okay. Power. Our biggest problem today is 6 months in the year, we don't have enough demand. We need to go to seasonal pricing. If your marginal fuel cost is 20 rupees, why do you want to add 22 rupees of capacity payment when you can't sell that additional capacity? Anything you recover above 20 is good for you and it'll lower your unit cost. This has to be done, otherwise your demand will keep getting destructed and your unit price will keep going up. You have to reverse the snowball effect. We have to go to smart metering system where we remove the human intervention in the meter reading and processing. Again, 5 years ago, Asad Saab will remember, we launched a program with ADB to put in smart meters in 2 discos, and there were so many legal cases. Then it got stuck in the courts, and eventually ADB, who had lent us $900 million to do that, got so tired and fed up that they canceled the line. We have to allocate gas on an efficiency basis to power plant. It's a crime today that we have captive powers using cheap gas, converting into power at an efficiency of 33, 34%, when we have plants that have 62% efficiency sitting idle with not enough demand, that can produce twice as much power from the same gas. We have to allocate gas using efficiency as the criteria, priority. Some of the older plants we have, frankly, we can buy them out today. Many of them have 5 to 10 year contract left. Today, the discount rates are 22% plus. You go to them and say, I discount the remaining payments I owe to you. 22% is the discount rate. Tell me whether you can discount a 30, 35. I promise you, I'm from that industry. Most people will sign up and say, fine, we terminate and get out of this. Well, somebody's got to start breaking that circle. And let me tell you, 4 years ago, this was negotiated and World Bank was ready to front that money. I don't know what they will feel today. The question is of a decision. We have to create an open access. This 27 rupee transmission cost is a nonsense. We have to focus on debottlenecking the transmission and forget about putting new power plants for several next years. Quickly, on the gas side, again, 7 specific items. Weighted average cost of gas. Law is on present. It needs to be implemented. We have to eliminate heavy cross-subsidy to fertilizer sector, what you were referring to earlier. And if we need to give subsidy to the farmer, it needs to go directly to the farmer. We cannot be distorting price. We have fertilizers that are getting gas at 550 rupees, and many of them are getting at less than 300 rupees until last year, while we have industry that's getting gas at 3,600 rupees. It is just not right. We are de-industrializing our nation by doing that. We have to stop new domestic connections. We don't have enough gas. We need to move towards LPG. We have to split the pipeline business into the pipes and the sale business, and the pipes have to become open access. And I already talked about if we can import LNG at $10, why can't we offer to domestic new producers, anything you produce, 20% discount of LNG will buy from you. It can only save us dollars and cost. And then finally, unless we build some gas storage, we will always be running from ship to ship. Privatization without regulation. I'll not go through each one, but this is extremely important. Let me tell you, I'm the biggest champion that we should privatize. But if you do not deregulate before you privatize, you are creating a disaster in the making. Let me tell you a little thing. Does anybody know who Carlos Slim is? Carlos Slim is one of the 5 richest men in the world, Mexican by origin. He was a billionaire in his own right, but then the Mexican government decided to privatize the government-owned single monopoly telecom company about 18, 19 years ago. He was the buyer. They did not deregulate the industry, unlike what we did in Pakistan. Result is he became one of the 5 richest men in the world. And the World Bank estimates that that one privatization, which happened without deregulation, has cost the Mexican economy 3% GDP. So if you privatize without deregulating, all you're doing is you're making a private monopoly rather than a state monopoly. You're really not creating any efficiency. So by all means, privatize, get the government out, but first, or at least in parallel, deregulate. So last slide, we started with Einstein. I'll start with another quote of Einstein. Einstein defines insanity by saying, insanity is to keep repeating the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. So nothing will change unless we learn to live within our means, balance your equations, to face the truth and stop blaming others. There's nobody else to blame but us. To remember that trust takes a long time to build and very easily broken. So let us not ask all the foreign investors, why don't you believe us? And why don't you invest billions that we want you to invest? Because nobody really believes us. We've broken that trust time and time and time again. And we are not market makers. We are irrelevant in the global marketplace. But we act as we are the price market makers, and we will define the price of everything. We think we are just too important. In reality, we are irrelevant. And finally, whether you like capital or not, you have to recognize capital has no boundaries. Capital is agnostic. Capital doesn't have nationality. Individuals may have nationality. You as an individual, I did that 20 years ago, sold everything I had spent, built, saved in my life and moved to Pakistan. But you can't say that for capital. You can say that for individuals. You can't say that for capital. So if we say the capitalists are the ones killing us, well, we are handing it to them on a platter. Here is an opportunity. Come and become a rent seeker. Let me end there. I know I've taken much more time than I had promised, but I hope this has given you a different perspective to what our problems are. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadeem. Excellent presentation. I told you this would be a treat. Thank you, Nadeem. That is very well done. Really appreciate it. Folks, we're open to questions. Go ahead, Afia. Afia is a specialist in energy. He's written a book on energy, which we'll give you later.
Thank you, Babar Sahab. Fully agree with what you said. Exactly, these are the same things which we are saying in our research. बस जो आपकी last slide थी ना, उसमें थोड़ा सी मैं addition करना चाहूँगी. You talked about end state monopoly. How? But what we are suggesting it should be through the stock market and not through straight away privatization.
देखिए, मैं मेथड पे आज आर्ग्यू नहीं करूँगा, क्योंकि मेथड कई हो सकते हैं, बट मैं फिर वही फोकस करूँगा कि पहले आप एक डीरेगुलेटेड एनवायरनमेंट क्रिएट करते हैं, उसमें भले आप स्टेट एंटिटीज नहीं भी प्राइवेटाइज करते ना, एंड यू लेट प्राइवेट एंटिटीज कम इन, लेट देम कम्पीट. अगर कोई स्टेट एंटिटी कम्पीट कर सकती है, परफेक्ट एग्जांपल इज पीएसओ. अब पीएसओ का मार्केट क्लाउड बहुत ज्यादा है, और पीएसओ को प्राइस प्रेफरेंस है, बाय द वे. मोस्ट पीपल डोंट रियलाइज दैट, बट they are competing with others.
But still, they have more than 50% of the
They have
market share.
46%, and as I
Huh.
said, they have some built-in advantages. But whether you list or whether you sell privately, ये हर सिचुएशन पे डिपेंड करेगा. जो आपकी बड़ी एंटिटीज हैं, जो लिक्विड हैं एंड एटलीस्ट ब्रेक इवन है, आई टेंड टू अग्री विद यू कि उसकी जो ओनरशिप है ना वो डिस्ट्रीब्यूट होनी चाहिए. लेकिन जहां आपकी एंटिटी ही परपेचुअली नेगेटिव में है और नेगेटिव नेटवर्थ है, आप उसको कैसे लिस्ट करेंगे? अनलेस यू डू व्हाट्स बीन डन विद पीआईए, रिमूव ऑल द लायबिलिटीज एंड व्हाटएवर एसेट्स आर लेफ्ट. जब आप ये लायबिलिटीज रिमूव करती हैं, अब आई डोंट नो हाउ द बैंक्स आर गोइंग टू डील विद दिस. आई एम फ्रैंकली वरीड, क्योंकि 278 बिलियन की डेट जो काइबर लिंक्ड थी, उसको 10-year बुलेट एट 12% फिक्स्ड कर दिया गया. आज अगर एनी इंटरनेशनल स्टैंडर्ड्स की बेसिस पे उसकी मार्क टू मार्केट अकाउंटिंग करें तो they've lost 130 billion rupees, these banks. So unless you clean up and transfer all the liabilities, आप एक नेगेटिव एंटिटी को प्राइवेट सेल ही कर सकेंगे, आप लिस्ट नहीं कर सकेंगे.
लेकिन प्राइवेट कोई खरीदेगा नहीं नेगेटिव एंटिटी.
देखिए, इन एंटिटीज के जो एसेट्स है ना, लेट्स टेक डिस्कोस, इनकी जो जमीनें अलोन है ना, दे आर वर्थ मोर. बात रियल एस्टेट पे आ जाती है. सो दैट्स व्हाई आई एम सेइंग इट रियली डिपेंड्स ऑन द सिचुएशन, केस टू केस. कुछ केसेस में चल जाएगा, कुछ में नहीं चलेगा. बट प्रेफरेंस, ऑर्डर ऑफ प्रेफरेंस यही होना चाहिए कि स्प्रेड द ओनरशिप, which means start with stock market. If that's not possible, then go to strategic sale. If that's not possible, then go to management contracts with some incentives. By the way, आजकल डिबेट हो रही है कि जी डिस्कोस को मैनेजमेंट कॉन्ट्रैक्ट्स दे देंगे, एंड आफ्टर दैट देयर इज नो स्टेटमेंट. फिर मैनेजमेंट कॉन्ट्रैक्ट क्या होगा, उसकी शक्ल क्या होगी? बिलियंस आर रिक्वायर्ड टू बी इन्वेस्टेड इन दीज एंटिटीज. वो जब इन्वेस्ट करेगा तो उसको मिलेगा क्या? कोई उस पर कोई डिस्कशन नहीं है, कोई रेगुलेटरी फ्रेमवर्क नहीं है, कोई रूल्स नहीं है कि ये रिकवरी उसकी कैसे होगी, क्योंकि वो तो चार्ज कर ही नहीं सकता कंज्यूमर को विदाउट गोइंग थ्रू दिस कॉस्ट प्लस प्रोसेस. तो इसका मतलब क्या हुआ? KE has just gone through this. They had a 10-year investment plan. They said we will invest 300 billion rupees, whatever the number is. ठीक है? NEPRA said no, you don't need to invest this much. Cut it down by 30%. फिर बड़ी बैक एंड फोर्थ के बाद eventually came close to some agreement. पॉइंट ये है कि अगर आपका रेगुलेटरी स्ट्रक्चर यही रहना है और फिर आप एक्सपेक्ट करें कि कोई आएगा और बिलियंस इन्वेस्ट करेगा, तो वो क्यों करेगा? वो तो यही देखेगा ना कि अगर मेरी कॉस्ट पे मुझे फुल रिकवरी मिलनी है और इन्वेस्टमेंट मिलनी है, तो वो कहेगा अच्छा अगर मेरी कॉस्ट 100 रुपये होनी थी तो मैं 150 स्पेंड करता हूँ, मुझे ज्यादा पैसे मिलेंगे. द इंसेंटिव इज रिवर्स देन व्हाट इट नीड्स टू बी.
One more question. You said you talked about the smart meters के वो ADB का project था. Why we need ADB or World Bank?
We don't.
Yeah,
We don't.
exactly.
We don't. हम लोकली भी कर सकते हैं, खुद भी कर सकते हैं, ये मीटर अब इधर भी बन सकते हैं.
सब कुछ हो सकता है.
प्रॉब्लम ये है कि उस वक्त द एंटायर मशीनरी वाज अगेंस्ट इट. सो ADB स्टेप्ड इन इसलिए आया कि ADB ने कहा जी मैंने 4 मुल्कों में यही प्रॉब्लम इस तरह एड्रेस करवाई है, आप मेरे साथ आए, चल के देख लें. एंड दे गिव अस अ केस ऑफ उज़्बेकिस्तान वेयर द सिचुएशन वाज जस्ट लाइक अस. सो इट वाज ऑलमोस्ट लाइक अ थिंग कि जी उन्होंने कंसल्टेंट्स हायर किए. वो जो हमारी टिपिकल एक मेंटालिटी होती है कि हम वही सोल्यूशन दें तो उस पर सवाल उठते हैं, कोई बाहर का आके दे तो हम एक्सेप्ट कर लेते हैं. वो इशू भी है, वो इशू भी है. मल्टीपल इशूज हैं. देखिए स्मार्ट मीटर आजकल सारी दुनिया में जो लग रहे हैं ना, आपका एक मीटर है आपके ग्रिड स्टेशन पे, एक मीटर है पोल माउंटेड ट्रांसफार्मर पे, और उसके आगे मीटर है घर में. आपके पास लाइव डाटा आ रहा है. अगर वो टोटल एड अप नहीं हो रहा तो उसका मतलब है इस मीटर पे इस सेगमेंट में चोरी हो रही है. यू इमीडिएटली पिन पॉइंटेड. हमारे यहाँ क्या होता है, अच्छा मैंने छापा मारना है, बाय द टाइम आप छापा मारते हैं 5 दिन बाद उसने जो चोरी करनी है करके फारग हो गया होता.
ये बदला सब छोटी सी मैं इंटरफेयर नहीं करनी, छोटी सी आपने बड़ी पंजाबी बात की है तो सारा कसूर बलूचिस्तान का. कल मेरे से किसी ने पूछा था कितनी यार बलूचिस्तान की कितनी ऑप्टिक है, कितनी है जी बलूचिस्तान.
सो लेट मी गिव यू अ नंबर. अगर आप बाय परसेंटेज चलेंगे ना तो द वर्स्ट ऑफेंडर इज बलूचिस्तान. अगर आप बाय क्वांटम चलेंगे Do you know who the worst offender is? Any guesses? No, of the discourse. Lesco. Lesco has the second best percentage numbers. But लेस्को का साइज बलोचिस्तान से 6 times है. Exactly. So you cannot divorce the two. Problem है entitlement culture के. Once you get to that mindset, then it's irrelevant के percentage क्या है, because then basically the customer is saying it's mine, it's free. It doesn't matter what the price is. ये भी लाहौर की है, मैं भी लाहौर का.
A very data-rich presentation. I learned a lot. This is Dr. Zishan. I work at PIDE. मेरी एक ऑब्जर्वेशन है और उसी ऑब्जर्वेशन बेस्ड क्वेश्चन है, आप डेटा से है. अभी एक रिनाउंड टेक्सटाइल ग्रुप ने पाकिस्तान में दे वांट टू परचेज अ सोलर प्लांट. तो मिनिमम जो रिक्वायरमेंट है 18 मेगावाट का सोलर प्लांट आप परचेज कर सकते हैं. उसकी कॉस्ट है $1 बिलियन. सो दे हैव द मनी. तो इसी वजह से मैं नाम नहीं ले रहा कि FBR वाले उनके पीछे पड़ जाएंगे. दे हैव द मनी बट द स्टेट बैंक सेज बाहर नहीं भिजवा सकते पैसा, आपको IFC से लोन लेना पड़ेगा, फिर आपकी पेमेंट हो सकती है. तो IFC की जो मिनिमम इंटरेस्ट रेट है डिस्काउंटेड दैट इज 5%. लॉजिकल में कि आप प्राइवेट इंडस्ट्री को कैसे. जी जी
मैं ये कह रहा हूँ ना.
अच्छा, ये मेरी ऑब्जर्वेशन थी. मैं आपसे कह रहा हूँ कि वी आर ऑन द सेम पेज. माय क्वेश्चन इज, जैसे आपने कहा कि अभी एक सोलर टेंडर गवर्नमेंट ओपन किया कि टेंडर ऑप्टिमल जो फाइनेंसिंग है वो क्या होगी, टैक्स से फिर करेंगे या इन्वेस्टमेंट से करेंगे या बोरोइंग से करेंगे?
यार देखिए,
थोड़ी की बात नहीं सर.
देखें, बात बड़ी सिंपल है. बेसिक फाइनेंशियल रूल है कि अगर आपका रेवेन्यू एक करेंसी में है और कॉस्ट दूसरी करेंसी में है, तो somebody is bearing that currency exchange risk. ठीक है. अब हमारी करेंसी एक ही डायरेक्शन में जाती है. अगर हम एक एसेट क्रिएट करें जिसका रेवेन्यू रुपये में आना है, सोलर प्लांट और एनी काइंड ऑफ प्लांट, बिल तो रुपये में जाना है, और उसकी कॉस्ट हम फंड करें डॉलर से, तो वो जो रिस्क है वो किसने बेयर करना है? सो जब इन द पास्ट स्टेट बैंक या गवर्नमेंट ऑफ पाकिस्तान ने कहा कि जी बाहर से लोग आए और इन्वेस्ट करें एनर्जी सेक्टर में, तो एवरीबडी सेड कि ये रिस्क गवर्नमेंट ले सकती है, हम नहीं ले सकते. पहले उन्होंने पॉलिसी बनाई 94 में कि ये रिस्क स्टेट बैंक आपको हेज ऑफर करेगा. फेरी, इट वाज कॉल्ड फेरी, फॉरेन एक्सचेंज रिस्क इंश्योरेंस. The day they gave some independence to State Bank, the first thing State Bank did was did away with that policy कि हमने कोई नहीं देना रिस्क इंश्योरेंस. ठीक है. So the risk fell to the federal government, and that is why I explained to you what it is. So अगर आप एक ऐसे एसेट को लोकली फाइनेंस कर सकते हैं तो आपको लोकली करना चाहिए. लेकिन स्टेट बैंक ये कहता है कि जी आपने इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का कोई प्रोजेक्ट लगाना है तो आप लोकली डॉलर नहीं इस्तेमाल कर सकते. आपको LC खोलने की इजाजत ही नहीं दी जाएगी. आप बाहर से डॉलर लेके आए. ठीक है. अब मजे की बात यह कि स्टेट बैंक ने आज तक कभी लिख के नहीं दिया, बिकॉज दे नो दैट इफ दे डू दैट दे आर वायलेटिंग सेवरल लॉज. लिख के कभी नहीं दिया, जुबानी इंस्ट्रक्शन जाती है बैंक को. सो द आंसर टू योर क्वेश्चन इज आइडियली यू शुड फाइनेंस इट लोकली. यू हैव इनफ लिक्विडिटी इन द लोकल बैंक मार्केट, but the regulator doesn't let you do that.
तो बड़ी पुरानी इकोनॉमिक्स की विजडम है कि जी फॉरेन लोन ले ही ना, सॉफ्ट करेंसी को फॉरेन लोन नहीं चाहिए, जितनी हद तक हो सकता है वो. अच्छा जी, जो ऑनलाइन पूछना चाहते हैं प्लीज पूछ लें. ऑनलाइन वाले भी इंक्लूडेड है. कौन? वकार साहब बोलिए.
वो तो हम पॉलिटिशियंस को कहते हैं कि पॉलिटिशियन रिस्पॉन्सिबल हैं. सिस्टम इनएफिशिएंसीज हैं, ब्लेम किसको हम करें? क्या सारा पॉलिटिशियंस को ब्लेम करना करेक्ट है? सेकेंडली कि वी नो द वे आउट. अब रेजिस्टेंस कहाँ पे आ रही है कि हम क्यों नहीं इंप्लीमेंट कर पा रहे हैं?
देखिए, ये ह्यूमन नेचर है कि यू नेवर वॉलंटरली गिव अप योर पावर एंड कंट्रोल. तो आप एक पॉलिटिशियन को हटा के किसी और को बिठा देंगे, कुछ सालों बाद वो भी उसी रंग में रंगा जाएगा. You have to create a market environment, and it's not something that will happen by flipping a switch. कि उनकी रेलेवेंस को आप कम करते जाएं। तो मैं इसीलिए कह रहा हूं कि प्राइवेटाइजेशन की बात बाद में करें, ओपन एक्सेस कर दे। मैं असद साहब को बेचना चाहता हूं बिजली, मेरे से मुनासिब किराया ले अपनी वायर यूज करने का। जब ये होना शुरू हो जाएगा ना, तो उनकी रेलेवेंस और मोनोपोली कंट्रोल खुद ही कम होना शुरू हो जाएगा। अगर आप ये सोचेंगे कल सुबह कोई उठेगा और वो एक लॉ पास कर देगा कि जी कल से हर चीज एफिशिएंट हो जाएगी, ये नहीं होना। इट्स अगेंस्ट ह्यूमन नेचर। यू हैव टू गो अराउंड इट। जितना ये डीप रूटेड हो चुका है गवर्नमेंट फुटप्रिंट इन द इकोनॉमी, ये मैजिकली नहीं होना, ये ओवरनाइट नहीं होना, ये किसी लॉ पास करने से नहीं होना। मैं आपको 4 लॉज बता चुका हूं इस प्रेजेंटेशन में, जो पास हुई हैं उसको इंप्लीमेंट नहीं होने दिया जाता। Why do we, I was lecturing at staff college couple of months ago. Earlier I was telling Asad this story. तो lecture के बाद मुझे पूछा, these are grade 20 officers going for their last promotion to 21 और last course. तो मुझे एक शख्स ने पूछा जी कि आपके ख्याल में SIFC की परफॉर्मेंस कैसी है। तो मैंने उससे कहा यार मैं इसका सवाल तुम्हें इसका जवाब एक सवाल से पूछूंगा, why do you need an SIFC? You have departments, you have directorates, you have ministries, you have cabinet committees, you have the cabinet, you have a CCI, you have a legislature. Why do you need an SIFC? Because we have become habitual in saying, अगर हमारी पसंद की लॉ है तो कर लेंगे, पसंद की नहीं है तो नहीं करेंगे। तो पावर जो कंट्रोल और पावर है, चाहे वो पॉलिटिशियन है, चाहे ब्यूरोक्रेट है, चाहे एस्टेब्लिशमेंट है, फ्रैंकली चाहे बिजनेसमैन है, वो वॉलंटरली कभी भी गिव अप नहीं करेगा। आपने मार्केट एनवायरनमेंट क्रिएट करनी है कि उसकी रेलेवेंस और कंट्रोल आहिस्ता 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 कम होता जाए। यार इशू इज नॉट द SIFC।
नो इट्स नॉट द इशू। मैं वैसे आपको
मैं इशू ये कह रहा हूँ कि जी गो हेड। सॉरी
मैंने इस पे, क्योंकि मैंने भी यही सोचा कि इसकी जरूरत क्यों है, मुझे तो यही इसकी समझ आई। अच्छा, मैंने आपसे सर ये पूछना था, वो ये था कि हु इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर ऑल द पॉलिसी यानी कि जो मिक्सअप्स किए इन्होंने।
वी ऑल आर,
No, but we
We
are the
all are.
consumer. How are we responsible for what the government is
आप इधर बैठे हैं ना पाइड में, whatever your role is, why aren't you agitating this every day? Why aren't you writing in the papers every day? Why aren't you on the TV every day saying this doesn't work? All of us have to do it. All of us. एक दिन मैं आपको छोटा सा किस्सा, I spent 25 years working in the US. एक दिन इसी तरह एक डिबेट हो रही थी, मेरा बॉस था गोरा, 5-7 हम, हर कोई इशू था कि ये करना है। एक बंदे ने कहा जी if somebody can do this part then I'll do this, किसी ने कहा if somebody can do this I will do this। वो जो गोरा था वो चुप करके सुनता रहा। उसने कहा ये आज की मीटिंग कैंसिल हो गई, अगले हफ्ते दोबारा मीटिंग करेंगे। अगले हफ्ते वो आया, बॉस था हमारा, एक डब्बा पकड़ा हुआ उसने, उसमें ढेर सारी टी शर्ट्स है। उसने कहा कमरे में आने से पहले ये टी शर्ट पहनो। एवरीबडी शॉक्ड, बट बॉस था, एवरीबडी वोर द टी शर्ट। टी शर्ट के इधर लिखा हुआ था आई एम समबडी। डोंट लुक एट समबडी कि कोई आके ये करेगा, ये आपने करना है, ये मैंने करना है, ये हर एक ने करना है।
ठीक है, वो मैंने आपकी बात मान ली। मैं एजिटेट करने लग जाता हूँ तो पर्सन मेकिंग द डिसीजन, उसका क्या रोल? Does he not have any responsibility to act?
Does,
properly?
absolutely does.
When he doesn't act properly, should he not be doing something?
Absolutely does. Absolutely does.
Shouldn't the system be doing anything to correct the mistake?
What is system? Define system for me.
Government.
इसको थोड़ा सा डिफरेंटली पुट करते हैं उस्मान। I think that the issue that arises जो हम बार बात करते रहते हैं कि फॉर एग्जांपल पावर सेक्टर का प्रॉब्लम आप देखें ना कितने देर से चल रहा है, about 40 years of 30 1994 1988 सब कुछ चल रहा है। एवर सिंस दो चीजें थी, मुगला तरबेला, उसकी हमारे दिमाग खराब हो गए, उसके बाद हमने बस और एक तीसरी सुई गैस।
बिल्कुल
ठीक है ना, चलो हो गया। Now the point is कि over this 40 year period we have not seen a single government report on the power sector. जैसे what you said just now, कोई रिपोर्ट तो हो जो पब्लिश हो, गवर्नमेंट ओनरशिप ले कोई व्हाइट पेपर, कोई ऐसी चीज। तो असद साहब यहाँ बैठे हैं, असद साहब मतलब पावर मिनिस्ट्री जो है या दो मिनिस्ट्रीज ने, we've never seen a report by them, a white paper or anything that comes out and says ये हो रहा है। हाँ, वर्ल्ड बैंक वगैरह एडीपी वगैरह बोल देते हैं, पर हमारी हुकूमत नहीं बोलती। we've never seen a parliamentary debate of this nature, we've never seen a cabinet debate of this nature। आप भी कैबिनेट में देखते रहे, मैं 3 साल देखता रहा। वो एक पावर पॉइंट है गंदी सी, वो जनाब गंदी सी पावर पॉइंट हमारे एक बंदे ने बनाई थी, नाम बताता हूँ आपको, उसको डिस्टॉर्ट कर करके बार बार पेश करते थे। क्लैरिटी
Why do you think he and I left the ministry very unceremoniously?
प्रोसेस दैट इज लुकिंग एट दिस।
देखिए बात ये है,
और एक और चीज, सॉरी, प्लानिंग कमीशन डज मोर एनर्जी प्लानिंग एंड द मिनिस्ट्री डजंट इवन लिसन टू एनर्जी। ऐसा इकबाल फॉर एग्जांपल रिसेंटली, मैं तो छोटा सा आदमी था, ऐसा इकबाल ने रिसेंटली 3 मीटिंग्स कॉल की हैं कि जी सेक्रेटरी साहब आ जाए, कोई सेक्रेटरी नहीं आया। उसने डांटा भी, कोई सेक्रेटरी नहीं आया। अब उसने लेटर सबको लिखेगा, चलो तुम बाय लेटर ही कुछ दे दो। देयर इज नो कोऑर्डिनेशन अमंग मिनिस्ट्रीज, नोबडी लिसंस टू एनीबॉडी, तो क्या करें?
देखिए मैं फिर वही बात करूंगा कि आप ह्यूमन नेचर के अगेंस्ट नहीं जा सकते। ह्यूमन नेचर ये है कि जब आप कोई स्पेस सीड करेंगे तो वो वॉइड कोई और फिल करेगा। एज द साइंटिस्ट से, नेचर हेट्स वैक्यूम। If you do not do what is your role, whatever it may be, that somebody is going to do that for you. And what they say and do in that role may not be the right thing from your perspective. आप लोगों का क्या रोल है? आप एकेडेमिया में हो या रिसर्च कर रहे हो, आपका रोल यही है। इनका क्या रोल था? आई कैन काउंट न्यूमरस टाइम्स कि इन्होंने कहा जी ये करना है, he was shot down, but he had the courage to say कि ये करना है। ठीक है, मेरे साथ तो इनको मालूम है, ये गवाह है, 3 दफा मेरे पे कैबिनेट में एक्यूजेशन लेवल की गई कि ये जो आप कह रहे हैं इसमें कोई 2 नंबरी है। तो मैंने कहा ओके, प्रूव इट एंड माय हेड इज रेडी टू बी चॉप्ड। आई फर्मली बिलीव कि ये करना चाहिए। आई गिव यू वेरी सिंपल एग्जांपल। ये गवाह है, इनको डायरेक्टली इफेक्ट किया उस चीज ने। ऑयल वाज डाउन एट $20। आई बेग्ड, आई प्लीडेड कि 3 साल की हेज कर लेने दे। इनको याद है, फाइनेंस शॉट अस डाउन। अगर वो हमने हेज कर ली होती तो उस 3 सालों में को $2-2.5 बिलियन हमने डॉलर्स में कमा लिया होता। आई वाज शॉट डाउन जी, इसमें आपका क्या इंटरेस्ट है? पॉइंट ये, इफ यू डोंट हैव द करेज टू से व्हाट यू बिलीव इज द राइट थिंग, देन नथिंग विल चेंज। There's no guarantee that if you say what is the right thing should be done will actually get done. But if everybody starts doing that, then something will get done.
Sir, let me add, the objective is not to, blow your own trumpet. हमारी जो ट्रेनिंग है, जो हमारी तरबियत होती है, और आपसे जो मैं पॉवर्टी कॉल्स उस पर जिसने पूछा था कि आपको तकब्बुर और फिरौनियत सिखाई जाती है, हमें एक चीज सिखाई जाती है, इंटेलेक्चुअल ऑनेस्टी एंड मॉरल करेज, जो किसी स्कूल में नहीं सिखाई जाती, घर से बंदा सकता है। ये नहीं कि मेरे बॉस रह चुके हैं, बट वी नेवर वर्क लाइक बॉसेस। कतर की गैस डील, अगर आपको मैं बताऊं कि हमने 3-4 साल क्या किया, हमने बेसिकली फायर फाइटिंग की, रेपुटेशनल डैमेज पाकिस्तान का बचाया। कतर की गैस डील के लिए हम गए, इन्होंने सबसे सस्ती गैस, शायद खाकान के साथ निकाला हुआ टीवी पे देखा, किसी ने देखा नहीं हुए, वेकॉग पे हम गए, क्योंकि सिंध के चीफ मिनिस्टर इनके क्लास का होते हैं, तो हमने वो फायदा उठाया। डिस्पाइट बलूचिस्तान गए, क्योंकि बलूचिस्तान के हकूक हैं, सुई गैस के अभी तक उनको सुई फील्ड पे फेडरल गवर्नमेंट ने कब्जा किया हुआ है, वी नॉट गिविंग देम, वो एक्सपायर हो गई, उनके पास जानी चाहिए। इन दैट एनवायरमेंट when we went to Qatar and we got the cheapest gas Qatar sold. साद अल काबी जो उनका वजीर बन गया अभी, कहता है कि आपने मेरे लिए बड़ा एम्बैरेसिंग कर दी कि मैं चाइना और इंडिया को क्या जवाब दूंगा, क्योंकि मैंने 9.3 ब्रेंड पे आपको दिया, नॉट 10। इन्होंने 4 में उस पे थ्रू आउट। आप पूछे थे सर कि हम क्या करें, when you're constantly fighting for your own reputation, how can you perform? अगर यहाँ आपके माहौल हम टोटली चेंज कर दें, you won't be able to deliver anything. So, wake up था weighted average cost of gas, Qatar gas,
और ब्रेंट अपना फ्लैट्स की प्राइस आनी थी 1 महीना, प्राइसिंग की बात है ना, आप इकोनॉमिस्ट हैं, 1 महीने की प्राइस आप कैसे कर सकते हैं? इंडिया में कहते हैं डेली, हम 2 वीक्स में। You cannot imagine the amount of resistance. One minister accused him and myself of being the agents of Iqbal Zaram because they wanted to take over his LNG terminal and nationalize. So it is, I'm not giving you an excuse, but खड़े होकर करना पड़ता है। एंड में इनके साथ मेरे साथ जो हुआ, मैं मजाक में कहता था, मैंने कहा any other society system he would have gotten a civil award for the saving and the energy security. उल्टा हम पे इल्जाम लगाया गया और
Let me tell you, even today, now almost 5 years,
sorry for this aside, but
the deal that we signed with Qatar is the cheapest long-term contract in the world, even today. So बात ये है कि you cannot say कि कोई और आके करेगा. It's not somebody. Can somebody do this? No, it's everybody. आपका एक रोल है, आप वो रोल परफॉर्म करें honestly, with intellectual honesty and courage. नहीं कर सकते, चुप रहे, कोई बात नहीं. If everybody starts doing that, system will change. If everybody expects somebody else to do that, nothing will change.
at one time, sorry, they came to us and they said, they means the government, कि जी आप अपनी सारी wellhead prices, remember they said wellhead prices dollars and में convert करो कि लोगों को सस्ती गैस मिले. The government's job is not to be a populist, communist, socialist. Either declare it People's Republic of Pakistan, fine. We'll have a communist. But government ये नहीं कह सकती कि जी एक commodity 120 रुपए की बाहर बिक रही है, मैं सबसे सस्ता पेट्रोल, ये प्राइम मिनिस्टर कहते हैं फास्ट कि मेरे होते हुए ना पेट्रोल डीजल की कीमत बढ़ेगी, ना गैस की कीमत बढ़ेगी, बिजली की 2 रुपए, ये दोनों साइड पे करते थे, उनको पता है. You can't operate like that. Either become a Marxist, Leninist and say, ठीक है, to hell with it, we're with it. Pretending to be capitalist, pretending to be friendly with the West, wanting dollars. Well, आप बताएं, वो केकड़ा में जो गैस निकली, I mean, honestly, I'll tell you, मैं पाकिस्तान में काम करता इनकी जॉब गलती हुई कि जी केकड़ा which was offshore Italian consortium था, उसमें सारे आए हुए थे. उन्होंने कहा E&I was leading it, ठीक है. उन्होंने कहा कि जी ये कंस्पिरेसी है, उन्होंने कैप कर दिया. वेल ISI की इन्वेस्टिगेशन हुई, एक वाइस एडमिरल गया, I'm not joking. I literally felt at times that बाकी ये पागल है. इनके साथ जो कैमरा पे इनको पूछा गया कि आप लोग बताएं, सिर्फ mind-boggling how people, but you have to operate. What I meant was that despite all those odds, you have to operate.
So,
अच्छा एक सेकंड जी, ऑनलाइन
कोई और questions?
ऑनलाइन एक सवाल है महमूद खालिद, go ahead. Mahmood Khalid, can you hear me?
Sir, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Quick question. You have talked about first deregulating. What about giving us some picture on what's the current value? Are you sure that we know the right value for the assets which we are talking about going to the public markets? Because most of them are funded by the PSTP. This is one. Second, like the PIE example which you have given, what do you think needs to be written off from the slate first before going to the private sector?
Let me start with the second part, which is the easier. If you look at in the power sector, what is called the circular debt today, it's about 2.6 trillion. And if you look at the receivables on the books of all the discos, that number is about 1.8 trillion. Out of that 1.8 trillion, in my opinion, no more than 200 or 300 billion is recoverable. Rest needs to be cleared out. Out of that 1.8 trillion, 650 billion is due from Balochistan. Not recoverable. Ain't happening. Write it off. So जो चीजें आप कैरी किए जा रहे हैं ताकि आपकी जवाब तलबी ना हो, लेकिन इन रियलिटी वो एग्जिस्ट नहीं करती, आपको वो राइट ऑफ करना पड़ेगा. आपको बुक्स क्लीन करनी पड़ेगी. अब आ जाए आपके पहले सवाल पे. देखिए, जो आफिया ने सवाल पूछा ना अर्लियर, आइडियल तो ये है कि ऐसी सिचुएशन में आप ये करें कि 25-26% कंट्रोलिंग इंटरेस्ट बेच दें और कोई लिस्टिंग की रिक्वायरमेंट डाल दें कि 4, 5, 6 साल बाद आप लिस्ट करेंगे, दैट वे यू हैव रिटेन्ड द कोट एंड कोट इनहेरेंट वैल्यू, और आपको वो झगड़ा करने की जरूरत नहीं है कि आज क्या वैल्यू है और क्या आज नहीं है। क्लियर केस इन पॉइंट इज पीटीसीएल। आपने कहा जी 800 प्रॉपर्टीज हैं, उन्होंने आपको एक प्राइस दे दी, बाद में उन्होंने रियलाइज किया उन्होंने ओवर पे कर दिया है। इट वॉज वेरी इजी फॉर देम टू से कि मुझे 800 प्रॉपर्टियां पूरी करके दो जो हम आज तक नहीं कर पाए। तो वो अगर आपने वो करना है तो 10 साल आप बुक्स ही इकट्ठी करते रहेंगे, यू विल नेवर गेट देयर। आप एक्सेप्ट करें कि वी हैव मिसमैनेज दीज एसेट्स। आप कहें कि 26% ऑफ द बेनिफिट मैं देने को तैयार हूं, जो भी लेता है, क्योंकि 74% इंप्रूवमेंट मुझे ही अक्रू करनी है। दैट्स व्हाट यू डू, एंड देन यू ऑब्विएट दिस होल डिबेट कि आज उसकी वैल्यू क्या है और क्या नहीं है।
Thank you very much, जी। I think सवाल तो बहुत हैं, but we should try and now close the thing. I think it's a very good webinar, mashallah. You've done a great job, really. मैं ये एक चीज और बताना भूल गया, जो I think मैंने कहा लास्ट में रिसर्च कर लो। Nadeem Babar has also degree from Caltech, I think, right?
Stanford.
Stanford. Wondering if Caltech or Stanford, one of the two. So both are the best university in the world. He's also got a degree from Stanford, and he showed it to me. Excellent analysis, very good. बस you're absolutely right. हम भी यही बोलते रहते हैं कि we are a confused nation. एक तरफ हम कैपिटलिस्ट हैं, एक तरफ सोशलिस्ट हैं, बट कैपिटलिस्ट नहीं, सोशलिस्ट ज्यादा है। और सोशल के अजीब किस्म के प्राइसेस पे फिक्स करते हैं, पता नहीं क्या क्या कुछ करते हैं। We try and wash people's asses to पता नहीं क्या क्या कुछ हमारा प्रॉब्लम है। दूसरी तरफ से हम इस्लामिक भी हैं, और तीसरी तरफ से हम दरबार भी लगा के बैठ जाते हैं। जो ऐसा ऐसी वो दरबार ही है, तो क्या करें। तो वी आर टोटली कंफ्यूज्ड नेशन। इस कंफ्यूजन को कौन दूर करेगा, मुझे नहीं समझ आती। बट ये मुझे पक्का पता है कि मेरी जिंदगी में चेंज नहीं आना, मुझे लगता है आपकी जिंदगी में नहीं आना, लगता है हमारे बच्चों की जिंदगी में नहीं आना। हमने ऐसी कंफ्यूजन में, और यू आर एब्सोल्युटली राइट, 100% टेक द ब्लेम, हमारी एकेडमिया हैज टू ब्लेम। We are not even on the table. We are not even an equation factor. And I must end by thanking Asad Saab for bringing you here. This is wonderful. Thank you very much. And we will, inshallah.
Thank you. Let me just respond to the last comment you made. You know, normally hota hai कि you have two systems and you're choosing between the two and you say, I will pick the best of both. Unfortunately, we have picked the worst of both. We've picked the worst of socialism and we've picked the worst of capitalism. And then we say, why does it not work? Yeah. अच्छा, एक चीज ना, again this is very relevant. मुझे किसी ने पूछा जी वेलफेयर स्टेट है हम, आपका इस पे क्या कमेंट है? मैंने कहा यार मुझे ये बताओ, स्कैंडिनेवियन कंट्रीज वेलफेयर स्टेट हैं कि नहीं? बड़ा उन्होंने सोचा और उन्होंने कहा हाँ जी है। तो मैंने कहा प्रॉब्लम ये है कि हम वेलफेयर स्टेट को प्रोडक्शन साइड ऑफ द इकोनॉमी के साथ कंफ्यूज करते हैं। वेलफेयर स्टेट इज द कंजम्पशन साइड ऑफ द इकोनॉमी। आप प्रोडक्शन को कैपिटलिस्ट कर लें, फ्री मार्केट कर दें, उससे जो बेनिफिट अक्रू होगा आपको एफिशिएंसीज का, उसको आप कंजम्पशन साइड में जितना मर्जी बांट दें। डोंट कंफ्यूज द टू। तो ये हमारी जो आपने बात की ना, ये तीनों चीजें कंफ्यूज हो गई हैं, हम उनको सेपरेट नहीं कर पा रहे। और जहां तक ताल्लुक है आपकी जिंदगी या मेरी जिंदगी, मैं ऑनेस्टली अपने बच्चों को कहता हूं, आई एम ग्लैड आई विल बी डेड एंड गॉन before it gets to a point where I say, how can I live? Thank you, Ji.